Okay, guys, so this week we are thinking through and discussing civilizations and ancient civilizations. And we probably just got done with some different group work and talking about some articles. So now you're going to be watching this and kind of then going into your group project. So when we really think about the main characterizations of a civilization, it really has to do a lot with the development of urban settlements. The first civilization is in Mesopotamia, the rise of agriculture, surplus of food and economic stability, and people staying in one location. And so we talked about all of these things, as well as some others as listed in the articles. And we're going to dive into two different ancient civilizations, one being Knossos and the other being Tikal. So first we are moving into this specific area here. And we're going to be looking at the ancient Greek civilizations first, or the prehistoric Aegean. Now in this we have the blue being Mycenaean art, which is taken from the Great Citadel of Mycenae, very similar to Knossos and Minoan art that we'll be talking about. The red being the Cycladic Islands, and then the green, which is what we're talking about today, is Minoan art, named for King Minos, and the art of Crete. So focusing on Minoan culture, which eventually assumes Cycladic early culture, and then kind of is thought of to be kind of like a precursor to Greek art as well. So that's true about Mycenaean, Cycladic, and Minoan art. So we're going into Crete here, which is an island. They have a lot of resources. It is large enough and sufficiently rich in natural resources. They grew grains, grapes, olives, reared sheep, goats, pigs, and some cattle. Sheep also important for wool and textile production. Limestone, basis for many Minoan structures, other like marble, wood, etc. We're moving into talking about Knossos, like I said, which is a Minoan civilization. And there's two particular periods we're going to be discussing. The first is the Old Palace period, which is 1900 to 1700 BCE. Now, there's two different palaces because of a fire and destruction of the first palace, which is considered the Old Palace period in this case. And then the New Palace period is the time after that in which they rebuilt the palace. And so it's the sort of second half of that artistic period. So the Palace of Knossos is built, it's a very famous palace and structure for early Greek art. And we don't know a lot necessarily about the sort of early architecture because it was mostly destroyed. But what we do know is that the archaeologist who discovered the Palace of Knossos named it after the Greek mythological story of King Minos, who was the first king of Crete and son of Zeus and Europa. And apparently Minos was a very sort of strong and powerful king, and he had a wife, Pasiphae, and three children, Androgeus, Ariadne, and Phaedra. And he had this great palace and labyrinth built for him in Knossos by Daedalus. However, this white bull appears to Minos, and Poseidon asks him to sacrifice it to him. And when Minos says that he will not because he wants to keep him, Poseidon sort of takes his revenge by making Minos's wife fall in love with the bull, and she has sex with him and has this child, which is the Minotaur. And so the Minotaur is kind of this flesh eating creature that they have to keep in a maze, and becomes sort of this horrific figure, but also that they have to, like, different people in I think in Athens, Every 9 years, 14 young Athenians would have to go to Crete to be fed to the Minotaur. And so King Aegeus of Athens and his son Prince Theseus were so appalled that they worked together to sort of defeat the Minotaur. And it does end up, he does end up accomplishing this, and he is going to supposedly stay with Ariadne, and I think there's some kind of controversy there. There's so many elements of this story. I want to say that he abandons her somewhere. But he also, when he goes home, after defeating the Minotaur with Ariadne's help, in having a spool of thread to lead him through the labyrinth, he is going back on a boat and forgets to switch his sails from black to white to show his father that he survived. And thus his father, King Aegeus, throws himself off a cliff and thus names the sea the Aegean. Anyway, I know that's a very long story, but it really comes to this mythological story that is very much connected with the labyrinth nature of the palace of Knossos. And the reason that it has this maze-like structure is because of the two structures built during the Old and New Palace period that caused this kind of maze-like structure that wasn't necessarily intended to be that way. And so with that, with the archaeologists sort of connecting those things, you have this whole sort of story built around Knossos as well. You might have seen it as well in Assassin's Creed Odyssey. It is in this video, let's see here, about Assassin's Creed and kind of moving yourself through the city, which I'll show you here briefly.
In Assassin's Creed Odyssey, you play as a legendary warrior following mythic heroes like Heracles and Perseus. It's fitting considering that in ancient Greek society, myths played a powerful role and often influenced real life and vice versa. A perfect example of this is on the island of Crete in the Masara and Pefka regions, where you may have noticed they're somewhat fond of bulls, more specifically, minotaurs. But where exactly did this iconography come from? And why is it primarily concentrated in Crete? As it turns out, Greece has a long history before the classical period of Cassandra and Alexios, and many of the myths popularized during their time have roots.
So this is all supposed to be Knossos here, kind of rebuilt a bit, though still in tatters. This is very much the palace that we're studying here.
Roots in Greece's Bronze Age. When it comes to the Minotaur, look no further than the Palace of Knossos just south of Heraklion. The palace dates back to around 1700 BCE, meaning that by the time Cassandra and Alexios visit it, the ruins are already over 1,300 years old. Discovered by archaeologist Sir Arthur Evans and his team in the 20th century, the site was believed to be the palace of the mythical King Minos. Evans decided to name the Bronze Age civilization after the fabled king and dubbed the people as the Minoans. But how exactly did Evans link King Minos to the Palace of Knossos? Well, as the myth goes, Minos ruled the island of Crete. After angering Poseidon, Minos' wife gave birth to a half-man, half-bull known as the Minotaur. With the help of the architect Daedalus, Minos constructed a labyrinth to house the beast and used it to punish his enemies until an Athenian named Theseus came to slay the creature. When Evans uncovered Knossos, he and his team discovered a massive amount of bull iconography. You can find examples of this all over the regions of Masara and Pefka. Believed to represent bull horns, the ornamental decoration on top of the building became known as the Horns of Consecration. Evans uncovered the famous bull leaping fresco, which led him and many others to believe that Minoans clearly incorporated bulls into some sort of dangerous ritual. You can find reproductions of this fresco in Minoan ruins all over Odyssey's Greece. Knossos, especially in its ruined state, was not easy to navigate. In fact, it was rather maze-like. Couple this with a dangerous bull leaping ritual, and suddenly the myth of King Minos condemning people to death by feeding them to a minotaur hidden inside of a labyrinth begins to take shape. With more than 1,300 years separating the Minoans from Cassandra and Alexios, it's easy to see how the myth of the Minotaur could seep into their culture, become twisted, and maybe even take physical form. Visit Knossos today and you'll be greeted by a network of ruins. What remains standing was rebuilt by Evans and his team. As a civilization that precedes classical Greece by more than 1,000 years, the Minoans were incredibly advanced, as the Palace of Knossos featured buildings 4 stories tall with built-in plumbing and rudimentary climate control. Minoan ruins are easy to spot in-game, thanks to their unique columns, which were actually thinner at the base. Made of wood, no original columns survive to this day. Much of what we know of the Minoans was learned by studying what they left behind, since archaeologists are unable to read their language. Frescoes like these are all that archaeologists have left to decipher, and can be seen in various underground ruins in-game. Given that they were the only form of communication we're able to interpret from the Minoans, they provide insight into Minoan culture, ritual, and clothing. Like the legendary Theseus, you'll have the opportunity to explore the labyrinth and slay the mythical Minotaur. But remember, like nearly all myths, the Minotaur is grounded in the reality of the real-life Minoan civilization.
So you can see the sort of extensive work that the video game developers went through to kind of get this imagery and ideas. I believe they went and studied the Palace of Knossos to kind of build this idea and imagery of it. And we're going to talk about some of the things here that were mentioned in this video as well. But it's really fun and interesting to see it being taken to a different level in Assassin's Creed Odyssey. Now, the Palace of Knossos is very interesting. And at the time, we don't know a lot about the Minoan language. We still don't. It's very much in this hieroglyphic script. But because there's not a lot of writing, what archaeologists have kind of developed is from sort of the object that they found, as well as sort of accompanying cultures that kind of are similar or have similar images. But they are well known for their great sort of quote-unquote palace structures and administration. Cretan palaces were large, comfortable, and handsome, with residential suites for the kings and his family, and courtyards for pageants, ceremonies, and games. And so there's lots of different imagery of storerooms, offices, administration, commercial, and residential life that you can see in Knossos. So we do know that it was kind of a thriving center. There's a possibility that there was a king in a throne room, which I'll show you shortly here. But some of it is kind of inferred from what archaeologists have found, as well as sort of the archaeologist's interpretation, as we'll talk about shortly here. But here is the palace in what it potentially looked like. So we kind of have some different renderings of what the palaces would have looked like and kind of what that structure and area would have been composed of. And you can see sort of all the little columns and floors here. Now, in the New Palace period from 1700 to 1450 is where we have a lot of the the art that we have to talk about, mostly because this is sort of post-destruction of fires and the earthquake. So we really know most about sort of the New Palace period with the reconstruction of the temple and palace and the different structures around it. So here's some different renderings of what it could have looked like as well from different artists. I think it's kind of helpful in imagining sort of these images and ideas. Now, Sir Arthur Evans was really the major archaeologist on this site, sort of uncovering and excavating this site. And he raised a lot of questions about sort of restoration versus conservation. In excavating this site, he very much kind of took artistic liberties in looking at this site, looking at some of the well-known Greek sites around it, and began this sort of extensive restoration in which he kind of recreated images and the columns and different sort of pieces from the time in Knossos of the New Palace period. He did cause some sort of damaging restoration. However, he was able to protect a lot of it as well. So he's kind of praised and sort of talked about negatively because he kind of did this restoration in kind of in the way that he wanted to do it, and thus kind of changed the narrative of what was actually going on in Knossos and favored sort of this very particular narrative in a particular time. But it did bring a lot of sort of power and interest into the site that did bring sort of visitors and tourists as well. So there is kind of good and bad elements of what he did there. But he did favor the late Bronze Age restoration. And a lot of the works are kind of more Mycenaean than they are Minoan. But he was able to sort of capture the imaginations of people coming to visit the site and look at it. So we'll look at some of that as well in some of the images that we have of the artwork there. But I'm going to show you some excavation images here. So one of the major rooms that Sir Evans really kind of restored was this throne room, in which he labeled it. And you can see this kind of throne that was discovered in this location, and he rebuilt this entire site. So utilizing what he could find on frescoes and other imagery in the room, he rebuilt this kind of quote-unquote king's throne or throne room with this heavily restored frescoes from 1700 to 1400 BCE. He also greatly restored the column work there in some of the residential quarters as well as in other locations. This is really how they would have looked, although none of them really survived because they are wooden and not stone. And when Evans restored them, he put them in stone, or sort of recreated them, that is. However, the downward taper of the Minoan columns has to do with the shape of the inverted tree trunk, striking columns in wood used so that the trees would kind of like taken and then flipped upside down. And then columns had this sort of black bulbous cushion-like capitals that very much kind of look like the Doric order as well. So you can see this is the Doric kind of capital cushion top, and then you can see that they get smaller as they go to the bottom. So kind of reflecting an upside down tree in the sense that they get smaller as they go taller. And you can see that he also did some alternative restorations on the exterior as well. So kind of in trying to rebuild this narrative, he created these kind of little scenes of restoration, trying to depict what it would have looked like in this area that he excavated, and did this quite a bit sort of around different areas of Knossos. Up next is some of the famous frescoes that were at the Palace of Knossos as well. This was one location called the Queen's Quarters, which has this very famous dolphin fresco in the Palace of Knossos. And it was potentially a location where the Queen sort of saw different figures. It's also called the Queen's Megaron, where she would have sort of held conversations with different individuals as well as sort of meetings. And it's this very famous fresco. It's very interesting in that it combines dolphins, fish, and these kind of little sea urchin creatures, which are really interesting here on the bottom. And it's very sort of modern looking in the way that it's depicted in these sort of, I would say like modernist looking dolphin creatures. Is kind of one of Knossos' most distinct frescoes, to say the least. And again, this is a replica of the original, which has been sort of highly preserved at the museum where it's being held. And if you don't know what fresco means, fresco comes from the meaning fresh, from the Italian word of fresco, where paint is freshly laid on wet or dry plaster so that the paint becomes part of the wall. This is a very famous painting technique that the Italians got from the Greeks. Italians very much in the Renaissance period are copying famous Greek sort of standards and are sort of inspired by their work. And so this is very much coming, this word fresco comes from the Italian word because of their use of it as well. But it became very sort of interesting and important because it comes sort of part of the wall itself. So that the paint is literally seeped into the plaster itself, which sometimes can help with the preservation of some of these frescoes. The bull leaping fresco is another really famous one as well, from the Palace of Knossos, and you probably saw it in that video from the Assassin's Creed. But it features many aspects of Minoan life, like bull leaping, processions, and ceremonies. But I would say it's probably the most really famous of the frescoes at Knossos, and it really kind of encourages and promotes this idea of kind of the Minotaur and King Minos and all of these things because of the inclusion of the bull in this image. And in some ways kind of gave Sir Arthur Evans some of these ideas about King Minos and sort of Greek mythology. And this is a very an actual ceremony that occurred, an actual activity, if you can believe that, where Minoans were actually bull leaping. So a young man would grasp the horns of a bull and vault it onto its back, a perilous and extremely difficult acrobatic maneuver. And so there's some different images of that. So let me get to my PowerPoint over here. So they have some images of how they think that would have occurred, taken from this painting, as well as some other sort of seals and images that they have of this activity as well, which I'll show you here shortly. So this is actually a rite of passage for young men and women. It's still kind of thought of as important today because people are still kind of participating in the rites of passage with bulls, like riding them or participating in the running with bulls. So it's very interesting to think about this activity that might have actually been happening in ancient Greece in the Minoan culture. That seems kind of impossible, right, or unlikely. So here's a sculpture from Knossos as well, and some other sort of seals from Minoan imagery that featured this bull leaping activity as well. Now, in this image, you can see that there is two sort of separate sets of figures. Ones that are slightly... Ooh, I'm sorry, I went way ahead somehow. Where we were. The lighter colored skin figures and this kind of dark red looking figure who's actually doing the activity on the bull itself. Now, this seems to be kind of clear in that usually or typically women are featured in this kind of fairer skin color, where the men have this dark red skin color, which would be sort of correct distinction for this image because it was typically the males performing this quote unquote bull leaping ceremony, right? As you can imagine. But at the same time, these fair colored figures are only wearing loincloths. They're not actually wearing like full garments. They're wearing the loincloths that men usually would, these sort of bottom coverings, right? So it's hard to know if there's some sort of gender fluidity going on here, or there's a sort of higher understanding of the difference between kind of fair skin and dark skin figures in these images. And so we're not entirely sure if that still stands or if it's different, but that's sort of the typical imagery that you would see, with the fair-skinned figures being the women and the red-skinned figures being the men of the images here. Which seems sort of odd, right? What is the reason for this? It just seemed to kind of be like their artistic convention for whatever reason. Though probably unnecessary if you're then thinking about like clothing and loincloths and that sort of thing. This is an image to help you see some of the details better, and potentially some of the colors that what it would have actually looked like in sort of its full glory. And it's really sort of a powerful image. It very much kind of goes back to this historic idea of twisted perspective. If you're thinking about the caves of Lascaux, where we have these cave paintings, where you have this use of twisted perspective, which you can see here in this bowl that would have been, that's in the caves of Lascaux, where that you can see both legs of the bull, even though it's a profile image of him, as well as seeing both his horns. Now you can only see sort of one set here, but you can see the other on the other side. But you can see sort of both of his legs. So he seems to have this kind of twisted perspective. And it very much also has that the painter brilliantly suggested powerful charge of the bull by elongating its shape and using sweeping lines to form a funnel of energy, beginning at the very narrow hindquarters of the bull and culminating with the large, sharp horns and galloping forelegs. So it became this sort of very elongated figure, animated by these Cretan figures with their long curly hair, and sort of their power in doing this ceremony as well. The kind of gracefulness of the figure on top, etc. And again, this is where Sir Arthur Evans, I keep saying Walter Evans. Arthur Evans was getting some of these conventions of thinking about the bull and culture, right? And connecting it with the Minotaur. So again, here you have the bull horns here. That was part of the Knossos iconography. So again, there's all of these links with bull imagery and bull iconography that made Sir Arthur Evans connect this, right, with sort of the Greek mythology of the Minotaur. This is part of another famous fresco at the Palace of Knossos as well, which is in Minoan Woman or Goddess. And this is sort of a fragment of the fresco that they had in her bright dress with her curly hair. And not many of them sort of survived in this kind of detail. Now her hair is black and curly, one curl down the front of her forehead here that you can see, and the others cascading down the back of her neck. She has this white skin. Again, this is supposed to be a color convention that is similar to the bull leaping fresco, as well as sort of Egyptian iconography as well. There was this kind of narrative of having the males in darker skin as well. She also has a darkly outlined eye that we can see, and bright red lips, an elaborately woven blue and red striped dress. She also has this sacred knot, which is this loop on the back of her neck here, which is tied with another loop at the nape of her neck and letting the clothing drape below. It was found on seals and different potteries too, this kind of imagery, and supposed to designate the wearer as a holy person. So she might have been a priestess and goddess, and that's why you kind of get this Minoan Woman or Goddess title. And she was part of this larger scene. So you can see her here. This is the most sort of preserved part of the fresco, and then all these other parts that they've sort of built together through restoration and conservation here. Potentially having some connection with feasting, or with some sort of ceremony of eating and drinking, as sort of told by the seating and standing figures of this imagery. Very sort of beautiful rendering. This fresco really survived, even though it's kind of a small section of it. It really says a lot about the culture and kind of this imagery that they were utilizing, this perspective, which is very much reflected on Egyptian iconography as well. I threw in some other objects here that I thought were really interesting. This is a Minoan double axe, something called a libers, an important sacred symbol of the region, usually accompanied female goddesses as votive offerings, and were sometimes had designs on them as well. So this one I'm going to give you a close up in a second here, but right here there's some pattern designs and imagery. They were also very famous for their pottery as well as jewelry making. It's really fantastic to see some of the really gorgeous jewelry and pottery that they produce. I'm going to show you some of the pottery, but we don't get to go into jewelry as much. But this is one of those pieces that's really kind of breathtaking with gold bees from the Old Palace period. So these are sort of much older. These are all from the Old Palace period before the New Palace. Now, their work very much in the New Palace period reflected some of the Cycladic art that we talked about. Remember the Cyclades Islands that are a different part of sort of ancient Greece iconography. And these are some Cycladic figures I wanted to show you that reflect sort of their production at the time of these very famous marble figures that they were producing, kind of pre/early marble work by the Greeks. And this is a woman or goddess with snakes, or a snake goddess, which was a sculpture found by Sir Arthur Evans in what he called the temple repositories, where he found a lot of damaged pieces that seemed to have been kind of thrown there while they were damaged. And this is very much considered, there's sort of different interpretations of this figure. Belief that it's either a mortal priestess or a deity or fertility image, bare-breasted goddess. People are not entirely sure on the sort of imagery that they're looking at. But this is the image of the location where it was found, where Sir Arthur Evans found her, and this is what she looked like when they did find her. Missing sort of her other arm and her head. And the hat that she's wearing with the cat on the top, as you can imagine, were found also in this same hole. And so there is a belief by Sir Arthur Evans that they went together, even though he's not entirely sure. The interpretation of this work is that there's a power over the animal world with snakes and the wild cat on her head, and some connection with water and regenerative power. And she has this Minoan flouncy skirt that's kind of like an apron, as well as being bare-breasted, which was kind of popular in these goddess imageries at the time. There's no real images of this type of sculpture anywhere but in Knossos, so it's kind of hard to know what the purpose of these images were. She looks like a regular Minoan woman in as she's kind of connected to a lot of that other iconography, but this snake's hat cat image is sort of a mystery, right? With this, why does she have this cat on the top of her head and holding snakes? So we don't know how much we kind of trust Evans' interpretation of this work. But it was created in this faience low fire glass-like type silicate. And this is a close-up here. This was another figure found at Knossos as well, and Sir Arthur Evans has kind of put them together as sort of figures that seem to be similar, with her having snakes go up her arm, which is kind of a little harder to see, but you can see the sort of movement of the snakes up her arm here. And her hair kind of look like snakes too. But this is sort of how he saw the imagery in his mind and sort of connecting it with Knossos. So this was kind of an altar ledge of a shrine that Sir Arthur Evans put together. Again, we have to sort of either inherently trust his decision-making and sort of this interpretation, or to sort of think, is this really sort of the purpose of this figure? We don't actually know. Moving into some of the pottery from the Minoan culture, the Harvester vase is really one of the most famous pieces of pottery that has survived in the New Palace period. It's this very famous rhyton, and a rhyton is a vessel used for pouring liquid, and it has this kind of ritual significance. It's created in brown soapstone, which is also kind of green as well, this steatite that I have listed here. But it also may have been covered in gold leaf at the time, so it was considered kind of this ritual object. And it's supposed to very much kind of look like these ostrich egg rhytons that existed at the time as well, which were very famous and part of the sort of Minoan culture, but something that is very much more delicate, right? As you can imagine, made out of an ostrich egg, versus creating this sort of in pottery, which kind of stands the test of time better. Now, the Rhyton features a procession of 27 men, and it has this really sort of famous iconography because of the way that the artist depicts the figures themselves in space. There's this great use of sort of space in the use of the figures standing next to each other. You can see kind of the depth more in this sort of supposed to make it look like one figure is standing behind another, something that we haven't really seen yet in Minoan iconography, right? It's much more sort of flat and not using space in sort of this sort of complete way. And the harvester vase is very much doing this in this procession. You have that they're kind of celebrating a harvest or harvest celebration. It could be that they're planting or harvesting. We don't 100% know, but it communicates this great sort of grace and vitality in the imagery as well, and the great sort of movement and power of the figures. They seem to be led forward by this figure who looks different than all the rest of them. He's wearing this kind of scalloped pattern robe with long shaggy hair, versus the kind of skinnier working figures that kind of move behind him. So the thought is that it moves from here all the way around to the back, right, of the vase. And here's some more images of the figures as well. There seems to be a great sort of movement and communication in the vase as well. You have this sort of power of feeling the movement of the figures forward as they carry their tools and the wheat, and the sort of even happiness of the figures and the characters as well. And you also have that they look like they're chanting. They have their mouths open. They seem to be singing. This figure in particular, on the back here, is also holding a musical instrument that was used at the time. So this figure is actually using something that we would have seen in Minoan culture, which is this sistrum instrument. So this one was found in a Minoan cemetery, and this is also seen it in Egyptian imagery as well. So again, encouraging this idea that it's kind of this procession of people dancing and marching and singing as well. This is another famous rhyton from this time as well, another famous drinking vessel. Again, the bull's head. So again, encouraging Sir Arthur Evans to think about this connection with the Minotaur as well. You would have poured the liquid for this into the neck, if you can imagine, of the bull, and then sort of drank it out of the bottom area of his mouth, potentially. So this weird sort of kind of funny ceramic object that you would have used to drink out of. Again, made of the same material as the harvester vase, this steatite ceramics. And there's this sort of great intensity that they go to in depicting the bull. You have this very realistic and stylized image. They dug in these kind of shallow lines and then filled them with a sort of soft white stone to make this imagery kind of pop out a lot more, so that you can kind of see, oh, sorry, this is what I want you to look at. You can kind of see the lines of the coat of the bull, and then they also sort of inlaid the eyes with red jasper, giving the bull kind of a wild, frightened, bloodshot look, but also sort of gives the image power and makes it realistic as well. You see the intensity of carving this, right, to kind of give this illusion of hair and of movement in the bull's sort of body, is impressive for something that's being used in ceremonies to drink from, right? It seemed to be a popular object and sort of well known, as it is shown on the wall in an Egyptian painting as a gift from visitors from Crete. And they found about 23 of them total in different sites around Greece. So some of them seem to have been destroyed after the ceremony or ritual, but they're very sort of prominent in the iconography of the Minoans as well. And in the Egyptians, as you can see here. Other pottery featured more sea imagery, like the dolphins. This is sort of a octopus flask here, as they call it, this sort of large marine style imagery with the tentacles of the octopus taking up sort of the whole pot itself, right? This use of space is very powerful and very sort of creative, as well as having all the little sort of sea creature objects around them. And this is an image of Sir Arthur Evans with both those objects, the Rhyton and the this is a different pottery, but the same sort of style of using the octopus and its tentacles. Finally, in sort of the final conversation about the Minoan culture, we don't know much about them, and this is sort of why Sir Arthur Evans has been able to take so many liberties with the Minoan culture, is that we do have some pieces of language, like the Phaistos disc here, but we have not been yet able to sort of interpret these hieroglyphics. We don't have any sort of sense of connecting these imagery to words, and so we haven't fully sort of understand this sort of distinct set of hieroglyphics yet. So the second civilization we're going to look at is that of Tikal, which is in modern-day Guatemala, in the sort of northern area here. So, and this is a Mayan culture, an ancient Mayan culture, and we're going to look at this city. It was one of the capitals of the area at the time. And again, this has another exploration and reconstruction of Tikal around 1956, which is much later than the exploration of the Minoan culture by Sir Arthur Evans. And so we have a little less of the sort of reconstruction that Evans sort of had the liberty to take in the reconstruction of the Minoan culture. In this sort of unearthing of Tikal, which was mostly sort of putting pieces back together that were sort of destroyed, as well as unearthing these structures, as you can tell from these pictures, they were covered in sort of jungle and plants and trees, and so they had to sort of just excavate these objects off of them to sort of reveal the structures themselves. So you can see some of these images that are famous from that. And again, these are the two men, Edward M. Shook and William R. Coe, who were separate field directors of the excavation of Tikal. I included a lot of these pictures because I just think it's crazy to think of these structures getting slowly buried in this foliage. If you can imagine sort of hundreds of years worth of plants sort of hiding them in this kind of camouflage is kind of interesting to think about. Now, it has been noted that only about 15% of Tikal has been unearthed. So even in the sort of exploration of it from the 50s to the 70s, so 15, 20 years of excavation, that they still have not uncovered, 85% of the structure. So there's still a lot of the Mayan culture that they could learn from sort of excavations, but I'm sure it just hasn't sort of been financed at present. But they believe it was sort of abandoned by the Mayans in 900 AD and then not rediscovered or sort of re-fallen upon until 1848. I mean, just look at this. Isn't that insane? So, Guatemala is very a prosperous place with rolling choppy hill. It's sort of better than the jungle that surrounds it. It's good for agriculture, and it really is kind of the classic period of Mayan culture, kind of the height of it, as it were. The Mayan people that lived there in Mesoamerica do still exist today. There's about 4 million of them, but they live in different areas across Central America. I'm going to show you this video of the sites. You can get a sort of sense for it here.
The ancient city hidden in northern Guatemala, Tikal National Park. Tikal was one of the largest ancient cities of the Mayan civilization. The city thrived for nearly 1,000 years, but was suddenly abandoned during the 10th century. The remains of the ancient city of Tikal, deep in the Guatemalan rainforest, were discovered by a missionary priest at the end of the 17th century. In 1956, an excavation project began to uncover and examine the ruins. This pyramid in Tikal was built over an older pyramid and then expanded gradually. Investigations brought archaeologists to the tomb of an 8th century king at the center of this pyramid. The king was surrounded by jade jewelry. For the Mayan people, jade green represented nobility. This is a residential area for common people. It is believed that at one period, Tikal had up to 60,000 residents. May is the rainy season in Tikal. Heavy rainwater soaks into the lime rock almost immediately. Since there are no local rivers, people invented an ingenious way to use lime rock to store water. Research reveals that the floor of the main square was tilted at a slight angle. Rainwater that fell onto the square ran down along a slope and into a cistern.
Professor, so that we may...
The residents of Tikal made plaster using baked lime rock fragments mixed with water. Once it was dried, the plaster became watertight. This system was used to collect and store water for some 60,000 inhabitants. During the 10th century, the ancient city of Tikal suddenly collapsed. Wars drew increasing numbers of people to the city until resources became overburdened. The impact of overpopulation and slash-and-burn agriculture led to a food crisis that resulted in Tikal's fatal decline.
We'll be talking about some of these parts more in detail, but I wanted to give you sort of an overview of the landscape of Tikal, anciently known as Yaxmutal. If you didn't know, this is a type of trivia for you, that Tikal was Yavin 4 in Star Wars, or George Lucas used it in his movie making, if you did not know. So in the area for agriculture, vegetation, and geology, they built on the swampy area, which was good for farming. There was an intense agricultural society, as you sort of gained probably from that video and their use of collection of water. They had resources like cacao, avocado, guava, cotton, tobacco, beans, squash, pumpkins, sweet potatoes. I know I put a comma between sweet and potatoes, and peppers and maize. It was dependent on the rainwater, and then droughts did devastate Tikal. We don't really know why they left the area. It could have been because of a drought or because of disease. We don't know at this point. 67,000 people inhabited the city of Tikal in 1500 BCE. Mayans had settled in villages and developed an agriculture based on corn, beans, and squash. And they built these ceremonial centers, so Tikal being one of them, with temples, pyramids, palaces, courts for playing ball, and plazas. Ordinary Mayan family occupied 2 to 3 houses arranged around an open rectangular space. And then you had the sort of royalty or aristocracy on the interior near the plazas, with the everyday citizens sort of living on the exterior of that area. Now, Mayan Tikal also has 2 different periods we're going to be talking about. I'm not going to dive into them extensively. I just wanted to sort of give you an overview of them. In the pre-classic period, it's about 250 to 250 CE, and then the peak classic period is 250 to 900 CE. And it's very much considered sort of contemporaneous to Teotihuacan in Mexico as well. So you can think about these 2 sort of cultures lining up together as well. Now we're going to talk about the kind of structure of the plazas and some of the sort of main temples that we see in this area, focusing right away on the 2 most famous and sort of most viewed temples, which are Temple 2 and Temple 1, and they're in the Great Plaza here, as well as having the Central Acropolis and North Acropolis, which are 2 big centers here for sort of ritual and ceremony. So Tikal had these 2 massive temple structures, being 1 and 2 here, and they flanked again this sort of area of the Great Plaza. And it was a vast paved area bounded by the North Acropolis and the Central Acropolis, like I said. To the east was another plaza, which was probably a marketplace, and then there had sort of different pathways to other groups of monumental buildings. They do become sort of funerary temples for some famous kings, which I will talk about a little bit, like the video discussed. So we will look at those as well. So, and here's the sort of name for them. I'm really not good with the Mayan names. Jasa Chankawil. So he's sort of the Great Jaguar is one of the most famous rulers of Tikal, and he's buried here. And then we have Temple 2, Temple of the Masks here as well. And then moving sort of further out is Temple 3, 4, and 5. Temple 3 is known as the Temple of the Jaguar Priest, likely a home for the King of the Dark Sun. We don't know his name exactly, but I'll show you some sort of ruler stela that exist to show sort of the rulers of those areas and sort of the inscriptions that are there as well. Temple 4 was the Temple of the Two-Headed Snake. It's the tallest in Tikal, but I would also say sort of one of the ones that's not sort of visited as often, mostly because of sort of its enclosure, but it does have people visit it, obviously, here, as you can tell. And then we have Temple 5, which is the second tallest temple. However, if I'm not mistaken, it became a really famous temple because the stairs are like too steep to climb here. And so they have built this sort of secondary structure for you to climb up this temple, if you can imagine sort of climbing these horrific stairs up the top here. But people do this, and you can see sort of the whole area really well from the top of this temple. And then, so like I said, I know this is a different map, but the other temples are here. Central temples being here, and then the final temple is Temple 6 and Temple of the Inscriptions, which is way over on this other side. And that's called the Temple of Inscriptions. It's kind of far off here. I don't think they've done as much excavation work on it. You can imagine that it's likely buried under here. But this is this final temple that we discuss. Now, what's important about this layout for the Mayan culture is that they built the temple layout very much focusing on astronomy and their sort of calendrical systems that they sort of utilize sort of astronomy and the stars to sort of make the most sort of accurate calendar that exists today. And so they were all built around particular dates of the sun. So the winter and summer solstice, as well as the equinox. So you can see that they kind of have their dates here, but Temple 4 had the rising sun of February the 12th, and then October 30th in the ridge of Temple 1 was the coming down of the sun as well. And so all of these had to do with not only sort of peak moments in their calendar, but also in sort of the changing of the seasons. So all of the placements of the temples have sort of ritual purpose, which is kind of insane to think about, literally building these structures around your sort of religious ritual constructs of sort of the calendar as a whole, right? And so the Mayans are really well known for this, of being very sort of highly intelligent, making this very developed calendrical system, develops language, and then utilizing all of this to create this sort of massive architecture. Now, there are a couple different calendars for the Mayan culture. The long count is probably the most famous, but it's part of the Tzolk'in calendar along with the Hab and 13-day numbers. It kind of circles along in this direction. I think I have a video here. Give me 1 second. Yeah, I do. So I've muted it because the music is really creepy. But you see it sort of moving along this axis here. So there's sort of 3 sections of this calendar that move with sort of different particular cycles. So the one which is on the exterior here, was known as a sacred calendar. It was 260 days. There were 20 weeks, and each had a particular meaning, 1 through 13. And then the Hab was part of a Solon calendar, which was actually a 365-day calendar that was used for tracking seasons and cultivation. There were 18 months that each had 20 days, and then it also added 5 days of bad luck to account for 365 days a year, and those days are numbered in order, and so it revolves, oh my goodness, around the Hab every 52 years. And so you can imagine this sort of system working kind of simultaneously. And it's all kind of part of the long count calendar, which would cycle through at least every 5,125.36 years. And it would sort of keep dates even more sort of accurately. Now, the long cycle has these sort of different cycles, like I was describing. I turned off the weird music of this, but you can kind of see the Mayan calendar sort of moving here in this 3D map. So you have the calendar sort of working together, the Tzolk'in and Hab. The Tzolk'in was a sacred calendar of Mayans and a 260-day calendar. There are 20 weeks. Each day is numbered 1 to 13, but not numbered in order. And the Hab is known as the solar calendar of the Mayans. It was also a 365-day calendar that was for tracking of seasons and cultivations. There are 18 months that have 20 days. They also added 5 days of bad luck to account for 365 days a year, and the days are numbered in order. And the Tzolk'in revolves around the Hab every 52 years, completing the calendar round. The long count, on the other hand, is actually sort of separate from that, and I have this sort of website that is a little better to sort of show you the calendars and me explaining it here. Because they have a few more details about some of that as well. But the long count calendar is chronologically dated mythical and historical events. The 13 Baktun cycle of the Mayan long count calendar measures 1,872,000 days, or 1,872,000 days, or 5,125 tropical years. And this is one of the longest cycles in the Mayan calendar, and hence why you have people believing that the world was going to end on December 21st of 2012. So the Mayans had built their calendar out until the sort of end of this long count calendar, which sort of terrified people, right? This is sort of a cartoon about it. But it wasn't that the world was ending on December 21st, 2012, as you obviously we know. But it wasn't ending, it was just moving on to the next cycle. And so it was moving on to the next long count cycle. So obviously it has nothing to do with sort of the ending of time, just the sort of way that the Mayan calendar was built. And all of this, again, was also built on hieroglyphs as well, and I'm going to show you that next. But these are all the hieroglyphs for the different months on the Mayan calendar. And hieroglyphs were their main form of language. I have a little more information about that because we do have some sort of surviving Mayan books, which I'm going to talk about here briefly as well. But people were able to sort of decipher this language. There has been some building of the understanding of the Mayan language and Mayan numbers, also having to do with the sort of dot and line system that they use, which I believe is discussed in this video as well about Mayan books. So let me play that for you. I believe it is on the Dresden Codex, and then I'll come back to the Paris Codex here. Okay, so this is a whole documentary by Nova about Mayan language and art and so forth, but this is just the section I wanted you to watch here.
Artist Jean Frederick Waldeck traveled to Palenque in 1832 to sketch its hieroglyphs. Believing that Babylonians, Phoenicians, or Hindus had built the Maya cities, Waldeck's drawings even included Indian elephants.
We now know that the Maya weren't even writing anything that visually looked like an elephant. He was not understanding the forms of the signs. And this is the theme that you see time and time again with artists trying to record Maya inscriptions up until the 20th century.
As more sites were discovered, explorers did their best to draw the unfamiliar glyphs. But their work lacked the detail needed for decipherment. Everything would change in the 1880s when Alfred Maudsley arrived with a glass plate camera.
Maudsley was taking full advantage of the new developments in photography. He had gone into all of the sites fully equipped with large format glass plate negatives and immense effort, these caravans of equipment.
You see these lovely photographs with the entire Great Plaza cleared. Well, it wasn't that way when he got there. He had to set a lot of people to work clearing these areas so that he could get decent photographs.
Maudsley's photos captured the hieroglyphs in exquisite detail.
If you're going to deal with an ancient body of inscriptions and try to crack an unknown script, you have to have a really good record, and he was the first one to make it.
But unknown to many scholars poring over Maudsley's photos, the work of decipherment had already begun, with the rediscovery of Maya books that had survived the Spanish conquest. 3 surfaced in Madrid, Paris, and Mexico. But the most exquisite manuscript made its way to the Royal Library of Dresden, Germany. It is called the Dresden Codex. It was forgotten until 1810, when a massive volume on the Americas was published in Paris and included 5 of its pages. Its strange hieroglyphs pushed an eccentric scholar, Constantine Raffinesque, to try and crack the Maya code.
He looked at these bar and dot numbers, and he said you never get more than 4 dots. A bar probably stands for 5. 1 would be a 1 dot, 2 would be 2 dots, 3 would be 3 dots, 4 dots. Then you'd have a bar, and then a dot would make it 6. 2 dots in a bar is 7. And that was the first time anybody had ever deciphered a Maya hieroglyph. That is the beginning of the decipherment.
The quest would move to Dresden, Germany, when Ernst Fürstemann, a librarian, stumbled upon the Dresden Codex. The priceless book had sat in the library overlooked for decades.
Can you imagine being able to pull out one of the most important primary sources in the prehistory of the New World and to have it there in front of you and just look at it and work with it?
Fürstemann discovered the Maya had developed a calendar to mark time and even pursued astronomy.
So you guys can definitely watch that on your own, and I'll put it up. But basically it goes on to sort of talk about more of the decipherment of the Codex and of the Mayan language. And luckily we do have, I think it's 3 or 4 texts that have survived. But unfortunately, missionaries that were coming into the Mayan cultures were burning these books, so we don't have that many of them. But the Dresden Codex is one of the famous ones. As I stated before, the Paris Codex also features a sort of calendrical system, which is here in these images as well. And these would have been read from left to right, and they're really sort of fantastic recordings of their culture, of society. I have a book that has like the replication of the entire Dresden Codex, which I wish I could show you guys. But it's fascinating that we have these books and we're able to sort of utilize them, which is something that we wouldn't have had if they were destroyed, which is quite unfortunate. I think I have another one of those creepy videos, let me see here, of them unrolling it too. Oh no, where did it go? Oh, I know what I did with it. I'm gonna mute them again, but this would have gives you an idea of how big the Dresden Codex is, or the Mayan Codex in Dresden. I don't know why they have to do this in the creepiest manner possible, but... Okay. But with this sort of great system, there was a lot of sort of use of recording information and ideas, and so that was sort of very valuable as well to the Mayan culture. And I'll show you that some more in some of the other artwork. But I wanted to get back to some of the architectural ideas and images. So again, we move outside of the Great Plaza and this sort of establishment of these temples built in sort of the seasons and astronomy, and this move into the central Acropolis, which is the administrative and residential area. This would have been an arrangement of sort of palace-like buildings that house kind of the rulers of Tikal and their families in this sort of central area. So again, right here. We then have the North Acropolis, which is here above the 2 famous temples in the Great Plaza. And this has a number of temples, as you can see. It's kind of built up in this really fantastical manner. And really kind of the most studied area of Tikal. It was, again, another architectural complex for royalty, as well as a center for funerary services for 1,300 years. And it also had sort of numerous tombs and burials as well. I've listed some of them here for you. It also featured a lot of sort of religious objects and information about the religious practices of the Mayans. They very much believed that the cosmos was structured in 3 levels. There was the transformation into spiritual deities, burials held in religious context, funerals, offerings for the dead in the afterlife, and sites and temples served as settings for myths, and then rituals and ceremonies, human sacrifices and sacrificial rituals, and the myth serves as model for the rituals themselves, and then also with solar myths and fire myths as well. And so we'll talk about some of these ideas, such as some of the ceremonies and sacrifices that occurred in the Mayan culture. Here is some Mayan gods featured in glyph form. This is a mask from the west side of Temple 33, which is in the North Acropolis. A lot of temples were decorated with stucco masks, often to the Mayan sun god, or represented the jaguar, old god, or shark. And so very much so, rulers considered themselves to be sun gods and part of that reincarnation of the sun god. And so this is sort of a representation of that on the temple form itself. Now, there were a lot of ceremonies of sacrifice in the Mayan culture as well, which is probably more sort of famous for being part of the Aztec religion. And most of the sacrifices happened here at Temple 2 in Tikal. Usually sacrificing to gods. Most high-level prisoners were not. Were sacrificed, I'm sorry. So some of the warriors and sort of the most important prisoners, and the rest of them usually kept for labor around the city. And it was kind of most evident in the classical period, with decapitation as well as heart extraction. And you can see that in these images here, in sort of glyphs. There were these altars in front of many of the temples that you can see here, which also had the stelae, which I'll show you as well, showing sort of rulers and their conquests. They did find obsidian blades and stingray spines, which were used for ritual bloodletting to appease the gods. These obsidian knives were mostly from Guatemala, from 600 to 800 CE. These in particular are from that period. And you can see it in a lot of this, in these reliefs from stelae and other sort of structures as well, in front or behind the altars, in which you can see sort of sacrifices occurring. They're often called the finished one, the sacrifice individuals are, and so you can see that glyph in connection with these figures. I know they're hard to see in these reliefs because of the color toning. But here you can see the tied up individual here. And then here you have 2 individuals with a skull on an altar here. And this is another altar piece here. And here's that one in a drawing. You can see it a little better. As well as a couple of different other examples with these same sort of images going around the exterior as well. So these sort of monumental images of sort of the sacrificing of these individuals to appease the gods, to appease the sun god. It was part of this whole sort of ritual ceremony. And here's the other one I talked about with the head. Here's another sculpture as well at the ball court. We'll talk about that in a minute. At Chichen Itza, which is a Teotihuacan in Mexico, depicting a sacrifice by decapitation. Figure at the left holds a severed head with the figure at the right, who spouts blood in the form of serpents from his neck. So here you have the figure holding his head. Here is the figure's body and the snake blood coming from his neck. Here are some more images as well from some Mayan pottery. You can see sort of the sacrifice of individuals. Another ritual activity was in the ball court at Tikal. This one in particular is outside of Temple 1, as you can see it here down below. This is a much smaller one than you would typically see in these sort of areas. But this was another ritual space, usually played by 7 players on each side, so a total of 14, each trying to get a small ball through a small hole, and had to often wear sort of protective gear because the ball was very hard and up to 20 pounds. I do have a video of people playing it that I'm going to post on the Moodle so that you can see them sort of participating in this. But often, the purpose of the game was to keep the ball constantly in the air between the two teams, whose number varied up to 11 players at some time. And in the end, if someone did in fact lose, one team or the other, then that led to the death of those individuals. And the game was really hard and really strenuous because you could not touch the ball with your hands, feet, or calves. You had to use sort of all other parts of your body to sort of hit this up to 20-pound rubber ball. And so here's an image on an area near there, an altar area. And this is a rendering as well, and I'll put up that video where you can kind of watch people try to reenact what it would have looked like. But it became part of sort of rituals and ceremonies, and then the sacrifice of sort of half the team that lost, or the team that lost, sort of half the grouping of players. But yeah, here you have the ball, and it going through the hole here, in theory, was the way to win. Here's some images on pottery as well. And the Mayans were one of the first people to create these rubber balls, although they were sort of hard and rough. It is one of the sort of central ingredients. Rubber is the central ingredient in creating these balls for this game, and the Spanish did take it back to Europe and sort of talk about this substance as a whole. And then here are some stelae that are in Tikal that represent rulers. So these were on either right behind the altars or in other areas of Tikal as well, that showed inscriptions of different rulers' names, as well as sort of their very famous and intricate clothing and their lifespan and sort of what they achieved. And so these were all over Tikal. You can see them again near the altars in other locations as well. And again, I know they're hard to read. Hopefully these sort of drawings help as well. So a lot of this public art was commissioned by rulers to document their descent from royal ancestors and to celebrate their accomplishments, like I said, and to also link their reigns to astronomical and mythological events. And so they were often carving these stones and altars as a way to sort of be pieces of propaganda, right, to show their importance and their value. So you would not only have sort of these images at the front, but also these intricate inscriptions on the back as well. And this helped to get, for historians to be able to get sort of a total of 33 rulers in a 577-year span, and to sort of know some of the different Tikal rulers, like the Great Jaguar, who built these buildings and who was involved in different sort of defeats, etc. And that temple, Tikal Temple 1, that was shown in the video, is the Temple of the Great Jaguar, like they showed in that video as well. You can see his burial here with the jade objects, like they discussed. And these were some of the other offerings found in his tomb as well. So again, we have people bringing objects to royal grave sites and burying them with them, probably for the afterlife, or using them in the afterlife, or to sort of represent their wealth and importance later in life as well. These are some carved bones too, in fact, and this is a structure, or a figure, a structure. Some more bone artifacts. They were actually doing these very intricate carvings in stone as well. Other famous pieces, I know we don't have a lot of time to talk about everything, but these are some pieces of pottery from the Mayan culture as well. I was showing you some of them before, but they're very famous for portable art like jade, shell, bone, fired clay, stucco-covered wood, domestic and royal works. Many of them sort of accompany people in their tombs. And Tikal art has also worked with feathers and textiles, but there's no example of these materials that have survived because they've sort of deteriorated. But we luckily have, like we've talked about, these stelae and these very famous pieces of pottery. Pottery has been sort of this fantastic source of information for people of what the Tikal culture was producing. I included these as some upon this time around that I was researching a little is that these are ear flare frontals, meaning sort of Mayans kind of gauge their ear with these jade earrings, and these would go on the front of those structures. And for some reason they call them ear flare frontals, which I find to be funny for some reason. And here's some other objects as well. So incense burner, a vessel, a pendant. So different objects using sort of human as well as godlike representations in these sort of fantastical art objects. All right, so now you can move on to your group projects on civilizations and follow sort of the guidelines and utilizing sort of the discussions that I have created to build your own. Good luck.